Good morning, everyone. My name's Councillor Louise Brown. I'm the Vice Chair, but I'll be in the chair for this meeting. If we could first go round to introduce ourselves.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny.
Eve Parkinson, Head of Adult Services.
Maureen Powell, Councillor for Castle Ward and Abenny, and a member of this committee.
Good morning, everyone. County Councillor Ruth Edwards, elected member for Lintilio Cresceni, and I'm also a member of this Adult Select Committee.
Good morning, Councillor Roger Harris, member for Crescent Ward in Abergavenny and member of this committee.
Morning, Sheila Woodhouse, member for Growfield Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Tony Crowhurst, representing the Disability Advice Project.
Thank you. Going through the agenda, could I have any apologies for absence, Hazel? Thank you.
We've got apologies today from Chris Bowie, who's our co-opted member for Mind, and also Councillor Paul Pavia, and obviously the Chair, Francis Taylor.
Are there any declarations of interest, or shall we just take them as and when? Yeah. Public open forum, there's nobody here, so if we go into item 4, which is the older adults inspection report, scrutiny of the report's finding and proposed actions, and Eve Parkinson, who's the Head of Adult Services, is here to introduce this report. Could I ask that when we come to comments that we're quite clear about, there's basically different sections to this report. There's first of all the report itself, then there's 1B, which is basically a summary of the main points that were made in the fuller report, which is in Appendix C, so that if you're making comments, avoid us trying to look for where they are. Could you say it's either in the main report, Appendix B, which is the salient points of this older adults inspection report, and then or C, which is actually the inspection report itself. So if I come over to Eve Parkinson to introduce this and go through the main points with us, and if you could also point out which part of the report that you're referring to. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Yeah, the purpose of the appendices, just to give everyone a brief, was the report is quite a long document. So what I did was I took the salient points out of the report, what were the strengths and improvements, and then I have in what we have been doing with regard to the improvements throughout, just to make it easier, and so that it was all in one document. So everything in the strengths and improvement document is a directly taken from the bigger inspection. So just to give a bit of background, the inspection happened May time last year. It was an inspection held over a 2-week period, and it was specifically related to older adults. It was a very thorough inspection whereby there were 5 inspectors came. It's a joint inspection across CIW and Health Inspectorate Wales. So a member of the Health Inspectorate also comes, and they did a lot of work looking at cases, going through the system, looking at recording, etc., etc. But they also spent a lot of time out visiting and interviewing across the patch. So they did everything from prisons to meetings with some of our independent providers, meeting with staff groups, meeting with individuals, meeting with service users. So all of that collective information formed the inspection report. The report came out in August, and that goes live on the website for anybody to see. Prior to that, we had an opportunity to respond, so there's some going backwards and forwards. But I meet with the inspector for CIW on a regular basis, and obviously the inspection and where we're up to with regards to the improvements are a regular topic of conversation. So just to pull out, the report reflects the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, so it's in 4 specific areas. So are people happy if I just go through those quickly? So the first is wellbeing. Our strengths are that we, as a local authority, have a very collaborative and outcome-based approach where we proactively look at what matters to an individual. That our multi-agency working is very effective. As you know, we have integrated teams across the county, and our vision is very much about well-being, promoting people's independence, but going back to our sort of strapline, which is helping people to live their own lives. And also, it was very welcoming to see a point saying that decision making is very much devolved in our teams, and as we're trying to move away from a very hierarchical way of working, as in people on the ground, people who are in people's homes every day are able to make decisions and know, you know, within what boundaries they can do that. Priorities for improvement were recording of the What Matters conversation. So basically, I think a lot of the conversations I've had with the inspector, that what we say and what we do is very positive, but sometimes that translation into the written word, it doesn't quite marry. I do know this is a problem that lots of areas are having across Wales. So we've developed a very robust collaborative communication network. Collaborative communication is a training way, I suppose, that's been commissioned by Welsh Government, where most of the counties across Wales have adopted this approach. We've adopted it sort of quite wholeheartedly, really. Everybody's had the training. So following that, we've developed mentors who are then devolve the responsibility in each of the areas. I think people will be familiar that sometimes people do training and then go away and carry on doing as they were done before, but we wanted to make sure that this way of working was embedded into everyday practice. So there are mentors in each of the areas, and we've been working very hard on ensuring that what matters and that recording of that is embedded into how they do it, and that's part of our supervisions, our team meetings, etc., etc. And our next steps around collaborative communication is to roll that training and that support mechanism out to our direct care staff, and then we would look to do that with the independent sector as well. We've had a couple of workshops recently, the last one very specifically about how people record. Another priority for improvement was around there was a thought that less experienced staff needed to have a more robust support mechanism, particularly those that have just qualified, and this was specifically in the area of social work. So from the other professions, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, etc., there wasn't the same concerns. So we've adopted a new approach to supervision, but we've also put in a new structure. So one of the service managers, who's a social worker, is working in the area where this is considered to be a problem. One of the recommendations from the inspection was that we look at our skill mix across the patch and think about moving staff around. Well, we have thought long and hard about that, because that also has consequences. You know, people, if somebody's worked somewhere for 10 years and they're very experienced and they're part of a team and that, you know, it fits with their work-life balance, it's not that straightforward just to say, oh, actually, you're now going to move to Abergavenny because someone newly qualified is in Abergavenny and needs to be in a more experienced team. So we decided that would actually cause more problems, really. So we've put a lot of support and pressure into an area where they had a lot of new graduates. And as I say, we've developed a new supervision framework, which we're rolling out across the areas, that looks at 3 specific elements of supervision. And this is linked directly to communication that I talked about before. So it looks at 3 specific areas which are in here. Another improvement was we need to improve the timeliness of domiciliary support. Well, as I've put in there, everyone knows the challenges that we have. You know, I think that we're doing lots more than lots of other areas around domiciliary support. You know, we've got Turn the World on the horizon. We've got the We Care campaign. We've done a lot around recruitment. And we know that there's lots of issues with the social care market nationally, not just in Monmouthshire. So it's not an area that I felt that it was easy to have a response that said, yeah, we'll improve that, because it's not that straightforward. It's a very complex area. Okay, going on to people's voice and choice. I'll skip through some bits because there is a bit of repetition. So again, the strengths were that there were good quality conversations, and they focused on a strengths-based assessment as opposed to a deficit-based assessment, that they very much reflected people's choices and wishes, which is very positive. There's positive engagement between staff and managers, again, not just within the local authority, but across the integrated teams. And also that we've got a good track record of piloting and implementing new approaches to what we deliver. So the priorities for improvement were particularly around safeguarding. We have just had in February a focused activity safeguarding. So I didn't want to put too much in the response around that for two reasons. One, we've had a lot of staff changes in the safeguarding team, whereby when we had the inspection, we actually only had 2 members in the safeguarding team because people had moved on. We have recruited and are waiting for new staff. So it's been a difficult period to expect people to be able to radically change what they're doing when they're just sort of overwhelmed with the day-to-day incoming. So hopefully the focused activity, which just looked at safeguarding, will give us some very specific areas that we can then look to work on when we've got the new team up and running. Another improvement was a clear understanding about procedures, state of assessments, reviews, contacts and referrals within WICIS. Well, we haven't got WICIS yet. So the improvement was round about making sure that as part of our planning for WICIS, we make sure that we incorporate some of those things so we can pull off those sorts of reports on a regular basis.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you say what the initials stand? Thank you.
They stand for Welsh Community something integrated system. I can't remember what the other C is. It's the new IT system that's been, yes, it's the new IT recording system that's being rolled out across much of Wales. So, and we're in the stage of, some areas have already gone live. We're in the stage of what our plans of planning and what our requirements would be in the recording system. So the comments that have been made following the inspection will be factoring into what we'll be looking at. So the third area is partnerships, integration and co-production. And it says that we've got a particularly good approach to integration with health and social care, and that the community hubs that we've developed and are developing are working to good effect. Areas for improvement were that the integrated teams would benefit from being underpinned by a framework of agreed protocols or other means of supporting this approach.
Can I come in there?
Yes, of course. Alice.
You've mentioned earlier that there are some areas of super expertise with some of the people that we have, and they're so busy, if you like, they haven't got time to disseminate it. Are there not any protocols in existence at the moment that would solve this problem, or are you starting scratch on these protocols because they're the obvious thing that needs to be laid down. Here's a new member of staff, here is a protocol. If you don't understand it, come and ask a question, sort of thing.
Yes, and I think we have protocols in place for that. What the inspector were specifically looking for were protocols around and that underpin the integrated working. So, you know, we have protocols around, you know, this is what we do with referrals, this is what we do, you know, we have that sort of thing in place. What they felt was needed was something that was in place across organisations. And if I'm honest, I had this conversation with the CIW inspector last Monday or the Monday before, around what did she feel the expectations around this improvement, because I wasn't really clear around what definitively what is it that you want me to do, and she couldn't really answer the question. So no. So, you know, we've done, you know, this is our structure, this is the operational responsibility, this is the governance, this is the professional responsibility, this is what happens in the fishbowl, this is what happens. So that's all in place. So I was actually a little bit lost about what those protocols were, because I didn't feel that we should be bringing in protocols just for the sake of it. And of course, there are elements where, you know, if you work in health, you work in health, and this is what you have to follow, because that if that's your professional body, that's what you have to follow. If that's the local authority, that's what you follow. And you can't just supersede that. So I think that that's a conversation ongoing, really. So we agreed that I would share with her, again, what our structures look like and how we deal with work coming in. And so she said she would have a look at that and then have a think about what the expectations were following on.
Well, that's good, because if you agree, then they've got to be happy.
Yes, yes, yeah. So I just needed some clarity around that, really.
Just as a, sorry to interrupt, just
No.
as a suggestion, the thing I was thinking about is sort of partnership protocols where people might fall between the gaps. And I wonder if that was what was being meant. You know, if somebody had a certain need and it was on the fringe of different agencies, and they turned around and said, well, it's not really us, and then the other person said, it's not really us, and who picks up the pieces? Do you think that might be an idea?
Yeah, I think that would be useful to put in the referral process to give them the assurances, because we don't have any criteria. You know, anybody, our only criteria is 18 and above and lives in Monmouthshire. And that's it, really. That, you know, we don't sift people out at all. So, you know, anyone can come into the business. So perhaps some reassurances around that would suffice for CIW. Prevention and early intervention. They felt that the strengths were that we'd done quite an extensive range of innovative and creative ways to support people, help people to get their own solutions. You know, things like the hub development, the integrated wellbeing networks, the cabin that's recently opened in Chepstow. We've been doing some work recently with GP surgeries around what's called care navigation, where receptionists and people at the front of GP surgeries have information so that they can redirect and signpost people. So they felt that that was very positive, and that there was a very a good approach to that, and that the fact that we're co-located extra supports that. What an area for improvement was around ensuring front door information, advice and assistance, as it's called, is more effective and compliant with the Code of Practice Part 2. We've had extensive conversations about this improvement with both Julie as the director, Paul Matthews, in that it's an area where we don't really agree with CIW. So CIW want the information to be collected by us around who seeks information, advice and assistance. And what we've done over the last few years, since the Act came in, and I would say beforehand, is developed front doors across the whole of the area. So, and those aren't all our front doors. And the point that we've made is that the Social Services and Wellbeing Act is everybody's responsibility, not just our responsibility. And so if you just collected our bit of the business, you're not collecting IAA across Monmouthshire. You're just collecting one element, because we're not asking GP surgeries. We're not asking the service that's been set up in the livestock market. We're not asking all our voluntary sectors, bridges, etc., etc. They are all IAAs. They're all front doors into the integrated business across Monmouthshire. So that's one element. So we're not going to be going to people to ask them to gather that information. Whereas in other areas, they have a single point of access where everything comes in and then they send it out. We've got all that out there already and continue to build on that. And another aspect is that if people are coming to us for information, advice and assistance, those people don't necessarily want to give that formal information. You know, if someone's coming to say, my mum's coming to visit for the weekend, I want to know where to borrow a wheelchair, and we say, well, you go somewhere, and they go off and do it themselves. They don't necessarily want to be saying, what's your name, what's your address, who's your GP, collecting that sort of information for that data set. They just want to have a word with us. Now, if that person is then going to be coming into our bit of the business, then we collect that information. But it's around that, people don't, there's no need to be asking for people information if it doesn't add value to them or to us. So it's an area that we've had the conversation with the inspectors subsequently afterwards that we've sort of agreed to disagree on that point.
Sorry, on that one, why can't you have, the sort of questions that have been asked, why a little list? Where's it fit on the list? Oh, it's approximately that one. We'd tick that box, and then you've got boxes. I know it's a tick box, but you've then got 28 people asked about wheelchairs, etc., and 369 asked about whatever. You can tell them, but you don't have to give names. And they ask
because that's what they want. As part
why
of that.
can't,
absolutely, yeah.
Why can't you give it to them if people are asking you for the information?
I suppose there's two elements from our point of view. One, what is the purpose of collecting the data? Are we just collecting the data so that CIW are happy? And Paul Matthews' perspective was, well, sometimes they just have to understand that they're not always right, and that this is okay. But I think the other thing is, how many people would we have to give that information to collect that? Because there's so many front doors out there, and it just seemed to go away from our ethos of being anyone can come to us, ask us anything you want, we will support and empower you. And then, do we have to keep a 5-bar gate on everything? So that we're in that sort of territory, really.
Sorry, can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just interrupt? Would you rather do the presentation and then ask questions afterwards? Or would you rather, as we go through, ask questions? Because I don't mind which, but as long as we know.
In some ways, it's easier as we go through, but I really don't mind.
Yeah, fair enough then. Okay, thank you. Could you do it through the chair, please, Roger? Thank you.
Okay, well, I suppose, like you say, yes, they're inspecting on us. But that response does go back to them, and they've accepted that we look at that differently. And another improvement around was that we should implement an effective quality assurance, and I'm in the process of that. I don't think I have included that in the appendices, because there's one element that we haven't quite finished yet, which is the element on safeguarding, but I will send that around to everybody. So we've started a quality assurance framework that looks at 5 specific areas. Integral to that is staff well-being, and we've currently got a survey live at the moment for a period of 2 weeks to gauge, how staff are. Do they feel supported? Are they happy in their job? Do they want to come to work? Do they feel that they have autonomy, etc., etc.? So we're waiting for the responses on that, but we've done a quality assurance framework that we hope will then fit not just for older adults, but it will fit for every element of the service. So it's taken quite a while, because people have a tendency to do a quality assurance framework for this bit, and this, where we've tried to do one for the whole of our adult services across all areas, so mental health, older adult mental health, learning disabilities, commission, everything. So we're just in the process of finishing that off, but when we've got that last bit done, I'll share it with everybody. And also, one of the improvements was around having a more extensive use of telecare and assistive technologies.
Sorry, just on that one, there's always been a resistance from the public on telecare. Is it still? We promote it, and people don't seem to want it. To my mind, is crazy. Is that still happening?
I think it varies a lot, if I'm honest. I think telecare and assistive technology is now moving on in a very different way. I think in the early days of telecare, 10, 12, 13 years ago, I think Welsh Government gave everyone a pot of money to buy equipment and whatever. I think in the early days, the equipment was in a very different state than it is now. And I think that, equipment didn't always deliver what people wanted or needed it to deliver. I think that now we're going into a world that I don't understand all the, land something and 5G and what have you. But the opportunities, I think, for telecare and assistive technology are a lot greater. I think that there's a huge hope that we're going to be able to bring in telecare and assistive technologies to completely reduce, the need for social care and what have you. I can't see that happening in my lifetime. Somebody who's having 4 double-handed calls a day, that's not going to be resolved by telecare. But I think there's a lot that we can do around the preventative, the isolation, etc., particularly, using some of the things. I'm not saying necessarily Alexa, but those types of things that can link people up. And I also think there's a lot that we could start looking around intergenerationally in supporting, a group of people who perhaps haven't been used to technologies, internet, Wi-Fi, etc., with younger people who could help and support them in what opportunities assistive technology can have for them. And I think we'll see a big shift as generations follow on. So lots of people, who now 40s, 50s, there will be an expectation. We're doing a project at the moment where we're looking at what sort of things would really help and support people in their own homes and keep them connected to their communities. So we're looking at, things like, say for example, you've got 6 chaps who are all interested in the 6 nations, but they're all housebound. Could we connect those up using Alexa so they're watching the match together virtually and sort of having that banter and what have you, and cheering together rather than watching it all on your own? So there's lots of opportunities around that. And then of course that naturally starts to create networks for people, doesn't it? And
Thank you, Chair.
Have you, before there's further questions, have you finished the
Yes,
presentation?
yes, pretty much,
I
yes.
think probably we're better if we actually look at the report that Eve has just gone through, and thank you for that presentation,
Thank
which
you.
is on 1B, because that goes through everything that's been said, and I think it'd be easier rather than going backwards and forwards between the different reports. So, Councillor Edwards, over to you.
It's just
Thank
that
you.
I wanted to follow up on the last issue that Eve has just presented with us. Well, my ward is very rural, and there's
Yes.
a lot of areas
Yes,
in that
absolutely.
ward that haven't got mobile signal
Yeah.
and so on. So it's very futuristic then to
Yes.
think that we can all be
Yeah.
interconnected.
Yeah.
Perhaps sometimes people who do like, I mean, I've got a family of 4 sons and a husband who like the rugby, that you could sort of get those that are isolated and can't meet up with the Wi-Fi or whatever
Yes.
into a system in a hall or something like that,
Yeah.
that could do it. And perhaps work
Absolutely,
it
yeah,
that way.
and you can look at it from different perspectives, and again, that would depend on what that person's wants or abilities were. Absolutely.
Councillor Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chairman. On that subject, yes, you really, that's very interesting. Somebody said to me only recently that his mother benefits greatly from Alexa. It does all sorts of things for her, and it does make her life a lot more comfortable. But I think this is something so different that we can learn a lot from obviously from other authorities, but we can pool resources with regard to finding out what can help people and learning from others, rather than, it's very innovative with
Yeah.
it's at the moment.
Yes.
But I can see there's going to be a great benefit to people.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
some of the examples you've quoted, have
Yes.
been excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for partnership with health colleagues in the future. There's some newish devices out, and they're called Armed. And basically it's for people who are at risk of falls, and it actually identifies to that person if they're likely to have a fall. So it lets them know if their blood pressure's going a bit low or if they're a little bit wobbly, and it actually says sit down. So I think there's lots of opportunities going forward.
Yes, Tony Crowhurst, please.
There's a few points that you've mentioned that make me wonder a little bit more about that. The integration is the key thing. I've had experience with my daughter about hospital discharge, to the point that I refused to take her home from hospital at one point because nobody had come to assess the facilities that she was going back to. Once she arrived at our home, the local authority were very evident, but there was no evidence of them being anywhere near the hospital or anywhere near the ward where we needed to have the conversation before Sarah ever left the hospital. While this report's being produced, I mean, it's obviously taken a while to produce, so Wales has produced a healthier Wales. And I'm wondering if any of the comments that are made here would have been any different had you had sight of that document before your report was written. And the third one, which is a bête noire for us really, is that when you try to consider the quality of life of anybody really, you talk about the input of the local authority and you talk about an R in Bevan, but you never mention housing. And housing is such a crucial part of the whole fabric of quality of life for people. Can they get into the garden and little things like that. So there's no integration mentioned here which would involve Melin or Monmouthshire Housing or people or other housing associations. So I'm wanting to know if there is any integration that goes on a practical level with that organisation. Thank you.
Oh, I'm still on. Okay. I'm not sure what you want me to start with, and I'm not sure if I remember all of it all at once, but I'll start with the last one. That's freshest in my mind. So from a wellbeing network perspective, we're doing a lot of work with the housing associations, I think, and with our own housing departments. I think that in some ways, and you're right, some of this stuff has been done in silos. So everybody's taken their from a Healthy Wales and thought, right, well, this is what we're going to do. And when we started sitting around the table with these people, everyone's not duplicating, but everyone's aiming for the same thing. So a lot of that has been around pulling that together. We have what we call community conversations that go on in patches around Monmouthshire. The focus of the community conversation is to look at a community and say, what's in this community? What are the strengths of the community? What are the areas that we need to improve? And housing is sitting around that table. So we're looking at that work collectively. What I was talking about before with some of the telecare and assistive technology, some of the loneliness and isolation, we've been linking up some of that work very specifically with housing and the housing associations, because they're having the same concerns that they want to look at. So some of the areas that we've been looking at piloting that have actually been Mellin or MHA sort of properties. So, and as for the housing here, we obviously have a lot of overlap when we're talking about things like disabled facilities, grants, etc., etc. There's a lot that goes on. But I think there could be more. And I also sometimes question, and have done, why some bits of the business sit in one area and some bits sit in another area, when, telecare is a prime example. So our telecare sits within our housing department, primarily because a lot of, care lines, etc., etc. But then a lot of the assessment is done within our bit of the business. So it's, where should those sit? Does it matter where they sit? How do we make sure we have better communication? So I think we do a lot with housing, and that didn't come up in what the inspectors looked at. Although I do think they met with Ian Bakewell, the head of housing, but nothing specific came out as a result of that. But we are working, particularly around that wellbeing network stuff. The first, when you were talking about a Healthier Wales, we actually submitted a document around our sort of integration, and I hope your daughter doesn't live in Monmouthshire, but if she does, then perhaps we could have a chat afterwards. Because we have worked very hard on that interface between the community and with secondary care. I think it's always problematic to a degree, because I think that secondary care, they're both very complex organisations or complex bits of the business, but we do have an in-reach model. So what we do, more so in Neville Hall than the Royal Gwent because of the location, but we have our own team of staff, social workers, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, who go into Neville Hall every day to see and assess our own people. So because our view is that, one, we know the services that are out there in the community. Quite often we know the person anyway, many times, particularly if it's an older person or somebody who's got, frail, or, we've been involved, so we know about that person, we know their home, we know their families, we know what services there are around them. So our perspective is that in-reach is a much more effective but also person-centred way of doing it. If the occupational therapist that you've known for 2-3 years walks in when you've been in hospital, then that's very helpful, has that history, but has that relationship, which is the fundamental cornerstone, I think, whereas in the old days, a physio and OT, a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist from the hospital team would have started all over again with that person, but also assessing them often in the wrong place. So we're also looking at that, or we follow that discharge to assess model wherever possible. So if somebody's able to go home from a medical, environmental, whatever perspective, then we'll get them home and do that assessment in their own environment. And I can't remember the middle bit, I'm sorry.
Can I just pick up on a point there? You said that you go to their home. The issue in the case of Sarah was that she was not going to her home. She was
Yeah.
having to come to ours.
Yes.
And nobody talked to us.
Yeah.
And that was, we think that's a complete and utter failing.
Yes.
She might be over 30, but
Yes.
nevertheless, the care provision is in the hands of
Yes.
ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
And I thought that was
So,
appalling. So thank you. With the housing one, if your OTs make a recommendation, do you find that housing associations usually take those recommendations up?
I think it varies. It varies on the time of year, varies on where their budgets are.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are lots of things that influence that. But yes, on the whole, I think we have reasonably good relationships with them, some better than others.
Can I just point something out, Chair? Because very often when Evie's talking, the camera's on her. I'm just wondering if...
That's all right.
Might be worth try turning it on and off.
There we are. We're not starting again, are we?
Has anyone else got any more questions? Because if not, I'll ask a few. All right, okay. I'll come in at the end then. Councillor Edwards and then Councillor Woodhouse, please.
Right, thank you, Eve. Thank you for your presentation. At least we haven't got a very long report to get through. But when you mentioned housing, now I think that when we are building new houses, I mean, they all know what I've got a thing about more bungalows. But when you get new housing and people go into them, they have a bathroom upstairs and bedrooms. They might have a toilet downstairs. But it should be that that toilet could accommodate
Absolutely.
a shower and maybe the manoeuvrability of a wheelchair or something, so that they don't have to move from their home simply because it's not adequate for the, for their mobility.
Yeah.
And I think that's a time in their life when they need that stability and the people around them, the neighbours that they know. And I think it should be mandatory that there should be a shower provision downstairs if they're in a two-storey house. And I think we should think more and more carefully about how we design the interior of these houses so that, it's their home, it's most probably their home for life.
Absolutely.
And they say, oh, well, you can apply for grants, but then that could delay them coming out of the hospital and all that sort of thing. And it needn't be like that if it's something is thought beforehand. Obviously, in some older houses, that it can't be easily provided.
Yeah.
But I think when we are building and have to build a lot more new houses, that should be taken on board.
I completely agree. I think that all new homes should have that view of home for life and have that ability to be adaptable and flexible no matter what, to suit a whole, variety of needs, whether that be from a physical issue or problem to dementia problems, because there's lots that can be done within a home, to make it suitable for, I completely agree.
Is it Councillor Woodhouse and then Councillor Harris? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Under the well-being areas for improvement, the last one, there's a need to improve the timeliness of domiciliary support to ensure people achieve their personal outcomes. The response to that, you mentioned some monies that were made available to support this, and that at the end of this month, the money ceases and the packages. I just wonder if you could explain what you're aiming to do with regard to that. A little bit further explanation as to how you're going to cope with that.
Well, we've known that the money's going to run out at the end of this month for a significant period of time. So we've taken a variety of measures to try and mitigate those problems. We've done a lot of sort of fairly intensive recruitment after the Christmas period, and fingers crossed that has been quite successful. So we have got quite a few new carers starting in our in-house teams, and what we've had to do is we've had to balance the fact that we've actually over-recruited into our in-house teams, but that balances itself by the fact that we've not been able to commission care. So we're using and underspending our this is what we buy care from budget to recruit in-house. So we've done quite a lot of that. We have also, there is slippage in that pot of money. So each of the boroughs has been asked what they would spend that money on, and we have said we would spend that money on continuing with some extra support around domiciliary care. We did use that winter money to bring in some agency staff around domiciliary care. That has been very difficult and complicated to manage. You know, I mean, it has kept us afloat to a degree, but it's been very difficult to manage on the ground. So we'd also badge some of that money against the over-recruitment as well. But we have got, whether by the time we get to the end of the month we'll get a blockage elsewhere, but obviously the people that are in the community who are phasing from one to another will be our priority. So we're confident that we'll be able to do it, but it might have implications elsewhere.
It's Councillor Harris next, and then Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Eve, it seems like it's a what's the best way of putting it? It's a sympathetically critical report. Let's put it. I think so. In any case, and the theme I can get through it is you're doing well under the rotten circumstances that you've got, and it mentions managers being under stress and the staff being under stress, which is, you know, knowing what you've got to do. I'm sure that's the case all the time. Now, we are a scrutiny committee, and if there's anything that you're brave enough to say to us that you'd like that we can pass on up the chain, I personally would love to hear it. Maybe you're not in a position to do that. I mean, the obvious answer is we need a lot more staff, but that's probably not going to happen. But if there is anything you particularly would like us to emphasise, then I'm sure we'd be happy to do that. And the second aspect is, you mentioned this report goes online, and presumably all the other 22 authorities are the same. What sort of, you probably looked at the rest of what was Gwent. How do we compare with the sort of criticality in our report with the others? Because that's also important. You know, are we worse in some aspects and better in others? Because, you know, we should be co-learning. So I'd be interested in your ideas on that one.
Your first point, Councillor Harris, I think about what you can do for us is, you know, one of the prime things that I think that you could support and help with is reminding, I'm being brave now, but reminding the powers that be to say thank you. You know, because I think that our staff work in a phenomenally difficult job, in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, and sometimes it feels a little bit like we're not a trendy bit of the business. You know, we're not a sexy bit of the business. You know, we're out there from 7 in the morning till 10, 11 o'clock at night. You know, out there in floods, in snow, in, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think the report does say that, you know, it is a staff group, and we know that we get what we get out of staff because they care, and that's really important. But I just think sometimes it's really nice to say, you guys are doing a great job. Thank you very much. Because we don't always work with a cohort of people, you know, they're all very grateful and very sort of happy, but they're not necessarily a vocal part of the population, if that makes sense. So I just think sometimes, you know, like the flooding, you know, our guys are working all weekend, you know, they're going above and beyond the call of duty, and I think that happens regularly. And I think that's why when I talked about the staff survey before, that the focus of the the staff survey has been on well-being, and I'm also doing a big piece of work. In fact, I've got a meeting this afternoon around mental health, but not as in mental health as in from a diagnostic point of view, but just how well are you today. Let's be kind and compassionate and support each other, and don't get on the hamster wheel and forget to look and go, because people have busy lives outside of work as well, you know, and we live in a world where, and so, you know, we're doing a big piece of work around that, because I think that I think it's crucial, and we're never going to deliver a quality service if we don't have a quality workforce who feel valued and respected. And I think any opportunities that you guys have to say, we need to make sure that people out there in social care are thanked, or they've done a great job. You know, they're not at home on Christmas Day tucking into their turkey, are they? They're out on the patch, and I think that's really important. And I don't think you can't underestimate how a simple thank you, you're doing a good job, helps with people. On your the other comment about inspections, not all the 22 local authorities have had the same inspection. They do a rolling programme over a 2-year period. So from a Gwent perspective, ourselves and Torvine were inspected last year. I share that with all the other heads of service. I have had a quick look at anybody else's inspection, and if I'm honest, ours is pretty good in comparison to some of them, which is great. But we do work from an all Gwent perspective, looking at each other's and looking at what we can steal, share of good practice as well.
Councillor Powell and then Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Chairman. Most of the things I wanted to know, the others have asked for me. Because in Monmouthshire, we've got a very high amount of people elderly. Well, I'm elderly, but I'm still here because I'm 82. When any payment comes from the Welsh Government, is it done on a person rate, a number of people, or is it just given a chunk to each authority, whether or no, or is it on the number of people that you'd have to care for? That's what
Do you mean what our settlement is?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there is a formula, but my view is that the formula probably isn't detailed enough to give the right information, and I don't think it necessarily reflects the demographics completely. Yeah.
Can I just say thank you very much for all you've done this morning and said, and I think somehow or other we'd love to be able to send a special thank you to everybody who works for you, because I mean, I know that many of you work long hours and you don't see much of your own homes and families, and I think it would be very nice if we could send a special thank you to all the people that are looking after the elderly.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's right.
Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Eve. I can only reiterate all that Roger's said. And we've had an abysmal winter. And we've got a big hill to climb now with the virus looming that might peak later on. And I can identify when you're saying 24/7 from being a dairy farmer. I know exactly what that means, whether you're dishing up Christmas dinner and you're out to calf a cow or something. And the weather has put a great deal of strain, especially on the farmers, and there's a lot that live in isolation on their own, and mental health then becomes quite an issue for a lot of them. And I think, as you say, thank you is wonderful, but I think we all need to be aware if somebody is under stress and strain. And I'm wondering, have you got enough staff now? Because more pressure will be on you to take care of a lot of the elderly with the virus that won't be able to get about. People might sort of pull back from visiting them and all that sort of thing. So are we adequately prepared with the rurality of this county? God forbid we have any more flooding or heavy snow or anything, but people will be worrying anyway about how they're going to get supplies, do they need medicines and all that. And I wonder how you are able to cope with all of that anyway.
Well, we're just in the process of doing our contingency planning now, really. And I think the primary elements that we'll be looking at are, what if we are going to people who have been diagnosed of having the virus? How do we manage that? How do we support people visiting those? And the other is, what if we have a significant depletion of our workforce? So that's what we're just working through at the moment. And in some ways, the similarities to what we do around more environmental things. You know, we have really robust contingency plans around, you know, who works where, what are their skills, looking at the broader workforce, not just, you know, those staff at direct care, those are occupation. We look at a broader sort of almost that place space, so who lives here, who can do what. And we also, for want of a better word really, but we sort of rag rate our caseloads. So we look at, you know, the red are the people that we absolutely have to go to, no matter what. And it has to be us, because there are certain skills that you would need to support and enable that person to stay at home. Amber are the ones in the middle. And then green are people that we do meet, but that do need our services, but are people that somebody else could go and help and support them if needs be. It doesn't have to be us. You know, so it might be that, and this is what we do with Snow. You know, we then go to, you know, communities, families, etc. If it's around, you know, shopping and making a meal, then the fact that you haven't got your food hygiene certificate, does that really matter? As long as you get some lunch or someone to light the fire or someone to go to the pharmacist, you know, so we then look at how we delegate those other low-level, practical, everyday things to other people, and we then will then focus our workforce on the reds and the ambers, but also we then hook up with our other colleagues. So, for example, in the flooding and in the snow, we work very collaboratively with our district nurses. So we then look at who are you going to, who are we going to, and then we sort of divide and conquer and work through that then together and support each other then. So, yeah, I'm not worried yet.
Don't think there's anybody else. Tony Crowhurst, please.
I'd like to pick up on the point made by the councillor in front of me here, and she mentioned homes, and we talked about the nature of the houses being built by social housing providers, and we know they comply to Welsh Housing Quality Standard, but the majority of houses are built by the Red Rose and the Barratts and all the rest of it, and they don't comply to anything. Now, I mean, this isn't a planning committee, but I would love your planners to at least put some sort of quota on the nature of the houses that are being built across the land now, to say that a certain percentage of them are acceptable for elderly and disabled people. That's not an issue for this committee, but if we're looking for Future Generations Act, if we don't comply with getting decent houses now, we're letting down the future generations in a very big way. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Could I ask a couple of questions now? I just wondered, in terms of the what matters, it mentioned about sort of different conversations and the recording of them. I'm not quite sure about this what matters idea, because one of the things is that you know, what an elderly person thinks what matters may be different from what a relative actually thinks that person needs. And there's often a disparity because of the person wanting to maintain their independence. And, you know, in a sense, my concern is if you only take the viewpoint of the person that you're seeing and not take account of other things, then, you know, is that person in a sense being under-assessed? I've got about 2 or 3 other questions, but perhaps rather than get too complicated by asking them all at once, I'll come back. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, from our perspective, the What Matters conversation applies to anybody it needs to apply to. So, you know, if we're seeing an individual and what matters to them is obviously important, and if they, you know, they have capacity, then they're able, then we have to take that into account. But also we would be looking at developing a relationship with that person's, you know, family, etc., as well. You know, if what matters to somebody who's been married to somebody for 50 years, what matters to their spouse is obviously hugely important. So we're not talking about just what matters to, you know, Eve. We're talking about what matters to Eve in the context of her life and her family as well. And if we're working with people who haven't got capacity, then obviously the involvement of the family is their biggest assets in a lot of ways. You know, we're relying on that family to give us a window into that person and what's important to them and what a good day would look like, but also that the family are, you know, are completely integral to that at all times.
The second question I got is about things associated with falls, you know, the telecare thing. How quickly do people get, you know, systems like, I mean, sometimes there's pendants they can wear, but the problem with that is that if you go to bed, you might think you're going to get strangled by a pendant. And then there's sort of like, you know, watch type of technology where you can press things which, you know, sometimes maybe only pendants are available, and sometimes there is a lapse between, you know, when people actually go home and when they actually need these extra facilities. And I just wondered if you could comment on how that particular telecare system works at the moment. And then I've got another question after that, but I tend to ask about 3 questions at once, and I'm trying to discipline myself to make sure I only ask one question at once. Thank you.
I think falls is really complicated, actually, and I think that when we're looking at assistive technology for people who have fallen or are at falls risk, we have to be. I think one of the things that's difficult, and this is partly because we don't have the equipment readily available, but that the equipment for that person is for that person. So there's a whole host of things, but they won't suit everybody. So some people will be at risk of falls because their vision might be poor in the night. Some people it will be balance. You know, some people fall in a certain way. So I think it's about having a range of things available that means that we can suit different people. We also know that, you know, the number of times we have someone who's fallen and they don't have their alarm with them, or it's not nearby, or they've taken it off, or it's a, you know, so the sort of compliance is such a horrid word, but the people sign up to wearing it, and then that's not helpful if you've actually gone unconscious as a result of fall, because you're not going to press your alarm. So I think it's having a range of things. You know, we do have things like, you know, we have falls monitors, where, you know, you wear a device, and if you go over very quickly and end up, you know, sort of fairly flat, then it alerts and alarms somebody else. We have bed sensors, where we know that if somebody's got out of bed. But again, you know, you also go back to that, you know, capacity. People have to agree to these things. They have to want someone to know that they've got out of bed. We also have these things called canaries, where we can monitor somebody for a couple of days who's at falls risk, so that we can then put the right things in. So I think there's a whole host of things that could go alongside falls, and I think we need to have a whole range of equipment that enables us to have more not bespoke, but individual solutions for people. One size doesn't fit all with regards to anything, never mind to falls. And I think there's much more that we could be doing to work in collaboration with GP practices, health boards, etc., and how we support and manage people who fall, because the cost financially, but the cost personally and emotionally is huge.
Yeah, Councillor Edwards, and then I'll come back to the other couple of questions I've got. Thank you.
Thank you. you, Chair, because it's a follow-up from what Eve was saying about falls. Obviously, they sign up to Talicare. Do you sort of go in, or somebody go in to assess their slippers, whether they've got rugs on the floor and all that sort of thing, to sort of eliminate the possibility of falls? Because that would be very often something that some people don't think about.
There's two, I suppose there's two elements to response to falls. Is from a whole service perspective, falls is everybody's business, and then we also, so everybody would do that, that more generic sort of assessment, you know, around you know, the environment, rugs, slippers, how you walk, how you get up, how you know, that sort of thing. Stand up, take a minute. But we also have a specialist falls team as well, who do a much deeper assessment around, you know, vision, medication, BP, where you fall, why you fall, when you fall, all that sort of thing. And then they put in a programme afterwards, whereby a worker goes in to go through with somebody to try and reduce and minimise their risk, but also to teach them what to do if they do fall, so that they can stay safe while they're waiting for help.
The question I've got was about the safeguarding, because you mentioned about the team, you know, not waiting for a new team and things like that. Well, when will this area be sort of fully staffed? Because obviously that's a concern that has been raised in this report about safeguarding. And safeguarding is obviously very important, because you mentioned, I think there was 2 members of staff and there was a new team. How big is the team going to be, and when is it likely to be in place?
The team will be 4 members of staff, 4 full-time members of staff, and the recruitment has, the interviews have happened, so we're just in the process of waiting for the recruitment of those people, you know, handing in their notice and coming to start with us. I think some of the issues with the safeguarding team, it's not the safeguarding team, I said, but the legislation changed recently, and that meant that the threshold for when things have to be highlighted became much lower. So the amount of work that comes in has grown exponentially over the last couple of years, which obviously had a significant impact on the team. So I would hope that within the next few weeks we'll be up to full complement, and then we can start to look at prioritising, you know, how the team works, what their priorities are, but also how we can then start to respond to some of the things that came out of that inspection, but also what comes out of the focused activity. And the informal feedback from the focused activity was in the main very good, and there wasn't an awareness that there was capacity issues, but in the main it was quite positive feedback, but we haven't had the formal report yet.
The other question I think that hasn't been raised in discussion, but I think when we had a pre-discussion it was raised. It was to do with the sort of continuity of care, I think, that was raised by people in terms of having a revolving set of carers coming in. I think, what was it, you know, it was a very large number that somebody mentioned, and whether that's monitored in terms of external agencies that you commission, and how you go about ensuring that there is that sort of relationship between the person who needs care and the carers. I appreciate that there might be a number, but if that number gets too high, then obviously there are difficulties there.
I think that is a predominant issue at the moment, due to, you know, the difficulty with resources and trying to sort of stretch the service as much as we can. I don't think we can always guarantee that level of continuity, although that's what we aspire to. And I think that that's why the implementation of Turning the World Upside Down, but also our plans to go place-based from a whole system perspective, would really support and enable that to happen. Because I think at the moment we want to have a very proactive service, but there are days when it ends up being very reactive. you know, and I think logistically it's a really difficult bit of the business. You know, you only need to have 1 or 2 members of staff ringing in sick in the morning, and all your runs have to be redone, redelivered, rerouted. And although, you know, as I said before, relationship is absolutely key, sometimes that becomes more problematic. The independent providers and ourselves, that's definitely what we want to aspire to. I would say that we're on the way, but we're not always there yet, but we are on a lot of occasions.
I've got a couple of other questions really to do with some circumstances that arose over the Christmas New Year period. The first one was about somebody who contacted me about a relative of theirs who was in need of mental health support. And, you know, I've obviously got to be careful about what I say in terms of anonymity. And I did try and ring the Gwent out of hours social services section, and it was, you couldn't get through to anybody. It was just ring back later messages. And I appreciate that this was sort of like a high peak Christmas New Year period. I did actually manage to speak to the Chepstow team. That was very helpful, because this particular person was falling through the gaps where nobody, although an adult, nobody, various agencies had been contacted by the caring relatives, but nobody was taking any particular notice. And I was very pleased that social services in Chepstow, which I eventually got through to, found the number on the website. But I initially tried the out of hours service. Were very helpful, and they said they would follow it up with a visit the next week. But in terms of sort of going through the front door, there was no feedback then later on as to whether or not, I mean, I said, oh, we'll get in touch with the relative and let them know, but there was no feedback later on as to, you know, whether or not that had happened and if this person had been supported or not. And I was very pleased that social services were prepared to support that gap in services where nobody was willing to actually do anything in a situation of crisis. I've got another question, but again, I'm trying to be careful not to overdo it. I'll come to a second one of an incident that happened over the Christmas New Year period as well. Thank you. If you could answer that question, thank you.
I'm sorry, I did listen. I'm not. Can you just clarify what the question is, Councillor Brown?
Yeah, sorry. Basically, the concern that, you know, the out-of-hours emergency number for Gwent, and it was for the whole of Gwent, didn't seem to be working properly over the Christmas New Year period, and, you know, just telling you to ring back later, which an emergency out-of-hours service shouldn't be doing. The second question is sort of about on the front door responses that in terms of recording of things, about whether or not when somebody raises an issue, whether there's any feedback following on from that. I mean, I was very appreciative of the response that I got to fill in the gap, but the question was why wasn't there any further feedback on, you know, yes, we've visited and yes, we've referred them or whatever. Thank you.
So from the feedback perspective, is that from Chepstow or is that from the out-of-hours or EDT service?
Well, you couldn't get through to the out-of-hours, so it was Chepstow. But as I say, their response was very good, and I was pleased that they did it. But I would have liked them to have come back later to tell me that they'd actually arranged a visit, you see, or done something. Thank you.
Yes. I think in an ideal world, I would agree, and it's a comment that we get also at times from other colleagues in, for example, primary care. It is something that we do talk about, and I think it goes a little bit back to what we were talking about before, is, you know, we keep our heads above water with regards to what's coming into the business, trying to respond, and I think that sometimes that capacity to feed back and say, this is what we did and this is what we've done, is what we should be doing in an ideal world. But at times when it's not so ideal, we're not. And I think it's something that we need to revisit as to how we do that and who takes the responsibility for doing that.
And the failing of the out-of-hours emergency service.
Yeah, I'll discuss that with the other heads of service, see if they've had any problems, and then we'll feed that back to them.
And the other question was really sort of a personal one, really, but it does show a gap in sort of care between the hospital and social services. During the Christmas period, my mother had to go into the Gwent, but while she was in there for a couple of weeks, occupational therapist refused to see her and liaise with her county occupational therapist in another, because she was visiting and lived in another county. And you mentioned we deal with care of people who live in Monmouthshire, but there's a gap when people who are elderly become ill visiting relatives, and nobody takes any responsibility for them on the sort of social care side, or when they're discharged from hospital. I mean, fortunately, my mother had a family to help her, but I just think this sort of, and apparently in the hospitals, the widest liaison they've ever had in Gwent from the discharge side is Gloucestershire. But when they talk about another country, not sort of France or Italy or anywhere, but England, it just seems as if the social services are so county-based that there's no inter-county working for people in need. And I think that's a gap in the system that actually does need addressing. And apparently my sister who worked in the health service, I mean, I think her care while she's in hospital can be recouped from the health system. But I mean, I don't know about the social services side, but the occupational therapist refused to do any work to liaise with the occupational therapist in a county in England. And I think, there is a bit of a, and it felt a bit like she wasn't getting the same service she would have done if she'd lived in Monmouthshire in that situation. Thankfully, she's back in her own county now. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Can I just clarify, was that the occupational therapist who refused to, was that the occupational therapist in the hospital? Yeah. So not the occupational therapist from Monmouthshire?
Well, she's based in Monmouthshire, but based in the hospital, yeah.
Okay, so that was it in the Royal Gwent or in? Yeah. Okay, so that, as far as if your mum was going back to your home, we should have got involved.
No, she wanted to go back to her home, yeah.
Right. So I'm just
She ended up going to a care home first, but it wasn't really so much what happened to her. It was the fact that in the hospital wards there were a lot of people who were based in Monmouthshire who were there for some time waiting for their packages to go home. If you go home somewhere else out of county and you fall ill when you're not in your home area, then there seems to be a bit of a problem there in the same support packages from the hospital don't seem to be as available.
Okay, it's just difficult for me to comment on it because the occupational therapy, because we have occupational therapists who are Monmouthshire County Council who predominantly deal with people in Monmouthshire, although they would support and help somebody if they were temporarily resident in Monmouthshire. But there are a whole team of occupational therapists in the hospital who should be assessing and supporting everybody and anybody, irrespective of where they come from, and liaising with their host county. So an occupational therapist who's employed by the National Health Service is obliged to assess and recommend anybody. And I'm saying this as in I used to be the head of occupational therapy at Neville Hall. They're not borough specific. Ours are borough specific, but those that are in the hospital are not borough specific. So they should be assessing and supporting anybody, irrespective of whether they come from. Yeah, well, that is what should happen, and it should be whether they're from Wales, England, Australia. They should be assessing somebody who's in an NHS facility. Well, if you want to give me the details, I can take that up with the head, the current head.
It's not so much, I mean, the circumstances have moved on, but I'm
Yes.
concerned about
yeah.
the gap in the
Yeah.
system, you see,
But-
for other people.
Absolutely. Well, I can take that up in principle, the occupational therapy service in Aneurin Bevan, because that shouldn't happen.
Sorry, Councillor Edwards.
Just to say, I dare say it's very concerning if people are watching in now on our live streaming, because I mean, I live just outside Monmouth, and there's an awful lot of people in the Monmouth area go to Hereford to the hospitals, and I'm sure they get a follow-up and looked after well when they do return home. Otherwise, they're not going to recover very well. But I have never heard of anybody having the problem going into England, as we say, Hereford hospitals.
Absolutely. I mean, we have people from England in our own community hospitals. We have people from England in, Monavale and Chepstow hospitals, and we support and work with our neighbouring authorities all the time.
Sorry, Councillor Powell.
Sorry. On the same subject, a patient who was lived in Hereford and was in Hereford Hospital, was being looked after by her daughter in Powys, and he got just the same attention and physio and everything, broken his hip, in Powys as he did in Hereford. So I mean, that's even skipping it. So it does follow on into your county, into the county that you're residing at the time.
Yeah, I think this probably was an issue that, in a sense, what we've talked about is surrounding counties like Herefordshire and Gloucestershire. But I think when you go sort of like 150 miles further afield, it may be more of an issue. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Tony Crowhurst.
I'd just like to pick up on something that the chair was referring to there. Aneurin Bevan have introduced this wonderful rainbow which illustrates the way that health should be looked at now. And it starts out, you look after yourself, and then you go to a lesser hospital, and ultimately you go to the Grange Hospital. And we're working currently with a group of people who have rare diseases. And there is nowhere in Wales which will treat Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And nobody is being referred to England, to the centres of excellence in England. So we have a big issue with Vaughan Gethin to really try and raise this profile. We're talking to the chair of the Rare Diseases Committee, because it's an issue where there's definitely discrimination against Welsh people who have Ehlers-Danlos. But coming more back to the report that we had here, it crossed my mind just now that when we're talking about care, we haven't included at all the people who are providing the most care, and that's the family members. We're talking about the social care professionals, and I'd be very interested to know if there is any interaction between the needs of the parents or the children who are providing care on a day-by-day basis and going completely ignored and nobody knows about them, and what support they may be getting from the professionals. Thank you.
Well, we have a team of carers support who work with people who are more informal carers, whether those are people who are providing, the majority of the care, or those that are providing care alongside us. We have a lead for that, we have a carer strategy, etc., etc. And I think that the work we're doing around the wellbeing networks, we're hoping that will support and enable us to see more of those people who are providing care that we don't even know about. We're not. It's a little bit like it's a bit like loneliness and isolation, isn't it? You only know what you know, but we need to be proactive in sort of spreading out more, whether that be through us directly or whether that be through some of the voluntary sector or some of the, primary care is a prime area, isn't it? So that we can offer more support. And I think an area that we are looking on how we develop this is also around how do we get more around the voice of the carer. What is it that needs to look like? We've been particularly looking at developing some support for carers and carer respite support for those looking after people with dementia, for example. And again, go back to that a little bit when we're talking about falls, when we're looking at support for carers, and you know, this is my perspective, when we're looking at support for carers and respite for carers, it has to be individual and bespoke. It can't be a one size fits all. It can't be, oh well, there's a group there that you can go to. It has to be, you know, do you want to do something with your loved one? Do you want to do something, you know, away from you? You know, so we have to get more individual and have more opportunities for people. But I think we need to use our wellbeing networks to really embed that support for carers and also our reach for those that we don't know, who may want us to know or may not want us to know. You know, so it's finding that balance, isn't it?
Right, unless there's anything else, we've given this a very thorough airing, and you know, thank you very much for the presentation and being in the hot seat and so forth. I mean, I think it's important in terms of the recommendations. We're meant to scrutinise this because of the fact that the inspection report has to give feedback, and some of the comments that we've made today can be included in that feedback is my understanding. And I think it would be difficult because we've had such a wide-ranging discussion to actually cover all of the areas. I think we talked about housing and planning, and we talked about safeguarding and telecare, and we talked about continuity of care. And is there any particular main aspects that I've missed out at all that anybody would like to add in terms of the conversation that we've had? I mean, I think probably the best recommendation would be to suggest, if you all agree, that you know, our comments and discussion could be taken into account in relation to the feedback. But I think also we ought to also say that there are strengths in terms of the response from the inspectorate in terms of innovative work and so forth. And I think we'd also like to you know, thank all the staff and be grateful to them for you know, doing a job in very difficult circumstances, and you know, the fact that they're out there in at all hours and all times to help cover things, particularly when things get bad, and also the extra strain I think that's being placed on all resources across the council with regard to coronavirus. And I'm pleased to hear that because of experience of snow and floods, then you know, that helps in terms of the contingency plans that the local authority has, because you know they know how to deal with these more extreme circumstances. I'm not sure if the staff will have training in terms of you know, if somebody gets ill in the home, as to protective equipment and things like that. But I think Eve is nodding, so that seems to be the case, you know, because obviously we don't want a situation where somebody is isolated and not getting the food and care that they need because of being particularly in a rural location that was mentioned by Councillor Edwards. Is there anything else that I've missed on that particular? Anything else you'd like to add? Sorry, Councillor Harris. Yeah, I think in case people at home didn't get that. I don't think the mic was on, but I think the suggestion from Councillor Harris was that also we should make a recommendation, perhaps to the cabinet member, about if they could pass on the thanks for the work that the care staff do in all types of situations for the people under their care, and in a sense, the unsung heroes of today. Could be recorded and sent on from. Could you ensure that's sent on from this committee, Hazel? Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I can't get into my system at the moment, but the next point on the agenda is to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting. It's on item 5 of the agenda. So are there any points of accuracy that anybody wants to raise in relation to those minutes? No. So can we have a proposer and seconder, please? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. What's the next one? Oh, the next item on the agenda is the Forward Work Programme for 2021. And if I go over to Hazel and she'll go through that with us. Unfortunately, I can't get anything on my laptop at the moment, so I'm going to lean over to see what's said there. Thank you.
Okay. A report that we were expecting to today's meeting, but has been delayed a little bit, is the assessment on gypsy and travellers' needs. It's in the final stages of being completed, so we've sort of deferred that to our next meeting, which is the 21st of April. And something I do need to draw members' attention to, you'll see that we have a workshop scheduled for the 26th of March at 2:30 p.m. and that was a workshop with the Health Board. It was just for committee members and co-opted committee members on looking at the local hospital and health service provision and some joint working around how we can engage with communities better and what we can do to deliver a healthy Wales better. Unfortunately, I've met with the Health Board this week and due to the coronavirus, we are not going to be able to have the key people that we need at that workshop. So the chair has agreed that we should postpone it and rearrange it for a date towards the beginning of May. So I will be doing that. I'll be writing to all members because I know it's something you've looked forward to for some time. But I wanted to write to you when I had an alternative date. This is a heads up from today that workshop will not be able to go ahead and there will be another date rearranged. Thanks.
So has anybody got any further comments on the Forward Work Programme? I'll take that as a no. So if we can move on to, I think it's the council work programme, isn't it?
If there's anything in there.
Yes, sorry, it's the Cabinet Council Member Decisions Forward Plan, which is the last item on the agenda. Are there any items there of concern that you think as an adults committee that we should have a look at or not? I think there's a homelessness report, but I think we've got one of those coming up, haven't we? Well, that's in January. That's already gone. If there's nothing anybody's particularly noticed that's relevant to our committee, then I'll close the meeting and say thank you very much to all members of the committee for your contribution to the debate today. Thank you. So I'll close the meeting. Thank you.